But it is brought to an end by the triumph of Rome. Right? So for about 80 years, Jews have their independence until Rome comes in. The Roman conquest is led by a general named Pompey, who takes over Judea in the year 63 BC. He enters the most holy place of the temple and finds it empty. Of course, probably the Ark of the Covenant has disappeared by this point. Some suggestions that it had gone into Babylon and was lost there. Other people suggested it's gone in places like Ethiopia. We all know that the Ark of the Covenant is in the Pentagon, thanks to Indiana Jones. But when Pompey goes into this most holy place, it's empty. And so he talks about the Jews worshiping nothing, right? And there's this big nothingness in there. And so, that's one of the other complex things here is that
This was 64 BC, right?
Yeah, 63 BC. Is that the Romans still understand Jewish worship, right? Because even when the Ark of the Covenant was there, it wasn't an idol like you would traditionally see in the Greek or Roman temple. And so the Romans don't really understand Jewish practices. During this time period, after Rome takes over, the Hasmoneans still maintain some control, but Rome's really the power. Eventually, a man named Herod will be selected as and given the title King of the Jews by the Roman Senate in the year 40 BC. He is referred to as a friend and ally of the Roman people, and evidently had a fairly good, if that's possible, relationship with the Emperor Augustus at the time. Herod will marry someone from the Hasmonean line, a woman from the Hasmonean line, to kind of further cement his power, because Herod is actually Idumean, not Jewish. And so there was a lot of opposition from the Jews because he's a mixed racial heritage. He's not judged from a Jewish line. And so he marries a Hasmonean in order to kind of further cement his right to the throne. He also is involved in a refurbishing and reconstruction of the temple, which even continued even to the time of Jesus. Ultimately, Herod was the Great, right? Herod the Great, not because of who he was as a character and his character, but because of his building prowess. He killed a large portion of his family, several sons, his wife. In fact, Augustus, the Emperor Augustus, is rumored to have said that he would rather be Herod's pig than Herod's son. In that, the Jews can't, they stay away from pigs, but if you're Herod's son, you could end up dead. In fact, Herod had decreed that his enemies were to be gathered together. He's getting sick, and he knows his death is coming, and so he has his enemies gathered together with orders that they're to be killed when he dies, so that there will be weeping at his death. He knows nobody's going to be crying for him, but he wants people to cry at his death, and so he figures a huge slaughter will accomplish that. There isn't a record outside of Matthew chapter 2 of the slaughtering of the Bethlehem infants and children. There's no outside extra historical evidence that verifies that, but it is very much within Herod's character. Herod dies in the year 4 BC, which he was the Herod that was alive when Jesus was born, so Jesus wasn't born in 0. He would have been born in 5 or 6 BC, and so if BC is before Christ, Christ is born 6 before Christ. Figure that out. The region is split upon his death. Archelaus, who's talked about in Luke, ruled Judea and Samaria. Philip the Tetrarch ruled a place north of Galilee. And then, of course, Herod Antipas, who was the one that John the Baptist condemned. He's in charge of Galilee and Perea. The emperor at all this time is an emperor named Augustus, or that's the name he takes. Octavian was his birth name, or his given name, I should say. And there are a couple of things coming out of Augustus's reign that are important for these kind of foundations of Christianity. First is what's referred to in Latin as the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. Augustus had an empire that was largely peaceful through Roman power. Which of course meant that as Christianity begins, right, even though it begins after Augustus' death during the reign of Tiberius, there is still some peace in the empire. It's not an empire at war. And so people are able to travel in relative safety, for example. There's still bandits, there's still thieves out on the road and in various inns and those kind of things, but relatively there's a lot of peace in the empire in the first century. Period of economic prosperity. Economic prosperity, of course, often breeds luxury as well as time, leisure. So people were able to, at least in some classes, able to spend time hearing things about Jesus. It was also a time of improved communications, and so messages could travel freely throughout Rome, get to their destinations. Of course, very important for as we think Paul writing his letters to these churches that he separated from. Period of largely stable government. That does not mean government was always moral. Right? For example, we look at the end of the book of Acts, and as Paul's in prison, Felix is wanting him to bribe, wanting Paul to bribe him so that he'll let Paul go. Right? So it's stable, but it's not necessarily moral. And there is within a lot of people in the empire a sense of renewal. There's something new taking place. So much so that later historians will talk about Augustus' birth as a evangelium, a gospel, a good news about Augustus' birth. With that being said, that doesn't mean that everything was always good for the Jews. In fact, during the first century, the second century, there were several Jewish revolts. One of the first takes place in the year between the years 66 and 70, when the temple is destroyed, so the second temple being destroyed. There was another revolt in 115 in places like Cyrene, Egypt, and Cyprus, where Jews were trying to get more rights. In the early 130s, a man named Simon led a revolt. At that time, the Romans had proclaimed circumcision, or proclaimed against circumcision, and planned to build a temple to Zeus on the Temple Mount. Right? The Jewish temple's gone, so let's use that space for a temple to Zeus. A prominent rabbi at the time proclaims that Simon is the Messiah. And remember, this is 100 years after Jesus. So many Jews are still waiting for the Messiah. So Simon is named the Messiah and referred to as Bar Kokhba, son of a star. His revolt is unsuccessful. After 135, Jews were banned from Jerusalem. Jews that were dissatisfied with Bar Kokhba referred to him as Bar Kokhba, son of a lie. As we think about these early political things that are taking place as Christianity understands it, how did Christianity fit into all of this? What was the political thinking about these people following Jesus? In those early decades after Jesus' death, the book of Acts. Christians are understood as a sect within Judaism, as just another group of Jews. Now we might say, well, no, I mean, they're different, right? And shouldn't they have been emphasizing their difference? Perhaps. But the fact that Roman officials looked upon them as a group of Jews gave early Christians some protection. The Roman policy was that as they conquered lands, people had to accept their deities, right? Jupiter, Mercury, some of the other ones. The Jews, however, were given protection from this, were given exemptions from this, largely because Jews tended to revolt when they were forced to worship more than one God. And so by looking at Christians as Jews, a group within Judaism, they were allowed the same sort of protections. But by the end of the first century, when more Gentiles are going into Christianity than Jews, Rome starts to take a different look at this group of people. And so eventually it becomes looked upon as another group that should be under the laws of Rome. However, I don't want us to think that this first century was a site of extreme persecution. Did persecution take place? Yes. Nero persecuted Christians in the year 64 and claimed that they were responsible for the fire of Rome. Domitian, toward the end of the first century, persecuted Christians. But those persecutions were largely localized, like Rome or Asia Minor. It wasn't an empire-wide persecution of Christians. And largely a lot of it was politically motivated. It's about politics. It's not about the worship practices. What questions or comments do you have about the political situation in this period? All right, let's move on to thinking about doctrine or just general teachings. And again, we'll start with thinking about Jewish doctrine. What are some of the things that were present in Judaism? Because I think that a lot of what we see in what we can call Second Temple Judaism is preparing the way for Christ. And a lot of the things that Jews are thinking in this Second Temple period, right, post-exile, are very useful in moving to Christianity. There are a couple of themes we see within Second Temple Judaism. First of all is the idea of individual responsibility and righteousness. Now, if you go back to 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, there's a lot of emphasis in there on collective righteousness and responsibility. That how the king acted toward God, whether he worshipped God or whether he worshipped Baal or some other deity, often had a profound effect on how the nation was treated by God. Yet the focus of the prophets of exile and post-exile was on one's own righteousness. So if you think about something like Ezekiel, who's prophesying during the exile, he's emphasizing the soul that sins shall die. You don't put the son to death for the father's sins. You don't put the father to death for the son's sins. And so the individual choice and responsibility began to be emphasized more. Now, was that a part of Judaism, Israelite religion before that? Yes. But it became much more of an emphasis with those post-exile into Second Temple Judaism teachings. Secondly, was the idea that the law of Moses was a guide to life. Now, we kind of expect that idea, but But if we think about how much of the law of Moses had been focused on ritual, sacrifices, we begin to see that by taking a different look at the law of Moses, Second Temple Jews started to emphasize that the law wasn't just about how to do sacrifices, it also was about how to live. And so those aspects of it tended to be emphasized. The morality, the ethics, and not just the sacrifices. Many of the prophets in the period prior to and after the exile focused on the notion of restoration. And so much had been lost in the exile with the destruction of the first temple, the loss of control, people being shifted to other lands. And so the prophets promised the restoration, particularly a Davidic restoration, right? The restoration of the land and the restoration of the kingship. And through this, the notion of an anointed one, a Messiah, became a part of Jewish consciousness. Now, looking back at it, you can see, okay, God is talking through the prophets about a spiritual king, not a physical king. But we're looking at it this way, is that the people are expecting something to happen. Right? They're expecting God to come as king. They're expecting restoration, even though they're expecting something different. A fourth thing that's very important for the transitions that will take place with Christianity is more localized worship. Now, within the exile, the temple's destroyed. And so Jews began the practice of worshiping where they were. Right? Reading the Torah, reading the law, singing the Psalms. That would continue after the exile. So there's a second temple, but there's still these synagogues spread throughout a variety of places. And so people were worshiping locally instead of focusing so much on the temple in Jerusalem. And of course, we can kind of see how that is very helpful with Paul's activity in those chapters in Acts as he goes to synagogues to talk about Jesus.